Okay, welcome to Poly 32071, Between War and Peace. I'm James Patterson, and I'm the module leader for this module. This module aims to consider what should be done instead of war. So over the next 10 weeks, we're going to explore the ethical and political issues surrounding the leading alternatives to military intervention and to warfare. These include economic sanctions, various diplomatic measures, cyber war, non-violence, all the way through to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the potential rise of the non-Western powers and changing to a post-liberal order on the alternatives to war. Today, I'm going to introduce the course, and then in the second half of the lecture, provide an outline of the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is known as R2P for short. I'll split this lecture up into two parts. The first part will introduce the course, and the second part will provide an overview of the R2P, the responsibility to protect. Okay, let me say a little bit about myself and my work, which informs the module. So I'm a professor of politics with my work lying in between political philosophy and international relations. I've written 3 books, one on humanitarian intervention, one on the ethical problems with the use of private military and security companies, and my third and most recent book explores the ethics of the alternatives to war, the subject of this module. You'll find that all 3 books are available online through the library system. I've also got a slightly rubbish website, www.jamespatterson.org, in which you'll find some of the papers, a few of which are relevant for the module, and a Twitter feed at James Patterson. I do sometimes tweet, but I'm not a big tweeter. I've been at Manchester for about 11 years and held various positions, including undergraduate director and research director. But recently I've had an AHRC funded project, Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project, that's explored the ethics of the alternatives to war, exactly what this module is on. The project was the first of its kind. There was no other detailed examination of the ethics of the alternatives to war before this. So what this means for you is that the module is based on cutting edge, brand new material. It's the first module of this type in the whole of the UK and probably the whole of the world. Hopefully you'll find exploring these alternatives really interesting and learn a lot. I've certainly found it very interesting over the past few years to research into them and to learn myself about the ethics and political issues with each of the alternatives. Now, let me say a little bit about the organization of the course. How's the module going to run? So I've designed the module to try to be as straightforward as possible. It's going to be divided up into 3 parts. The first part will be much shorter. It will provide some conceptual and empirical background to the case for the alternatives. We're going to do a bit of that today, and then next week we're going to explore just war theory. So today we're going to do a little bit about why you need to think about the case for the alternatives, and then we're going to look at the responsibility to protect doctrine. Next week we're going to look at just war theory and the problems with using warfare as a response to various crises. Then in the second part of the module, the longest part of the module, we're going to explore the leading alternatives in detail. I've already mentioned some of these: sanctions, diplomacy, non-violence, cyber, so on. Then, at the end of the module, we're going to look towards the future, where we look at the alternatives in the changing world due to the rise of non-Western states and the COVID-19 pandemic, and how this affects the political and ethical case for the alternatives to war. Now, there's a lot involved with each of the alternatives, and it might be hard for you to get your head around the case for all of them. There's complex issues involved. So to try to make things easier, we will look at each individual alternative discreetly in each week. What this means for you guys is that if you don't quite follow the argument in one week, you should be able to follow the argument in the next. But on the other hand, to really understand the course and to really excel at the course, you'll need to get to grips fully with what's covered across the whole range of the module. And sometimes the ideas and arguments that we look at in 1 week will affect the ideas and arguments that we look at in the next. For instance, we're going to be looking at economic sanctions. The arguments for and against economic sanctions affect significantly the argument for and against positive inducements that we look at in week 6. Okay, let me now say something about the assignments. You probably don't want to hear this, but the assignments. Hopefully these are going to be straightforward for you. Since this is your 3rd year, I've tried to give you the best opportunity to get good marks. There's no fancy new forms of assignment where you shouldn't know what you're doing. It's what you should be very familiar with: an essay, an exam, and participation. Now you'll notice that the essay questions are largely focused on particular alternatives. So you should be able to concentrate on one alternative and consider this in detail. Similarly, the exam in previous years, the format has been to have 7 questions on 8 possible alternatives. So what's that meant? What that has meant is that you will be able to, the students have been able to research 2 to 3 alternatives without having to cover the whole course. In this year, it will be, of course, an online exam. I need to check the format of this, but I'd like to do something similar if I can. Now, a few more points about the organisation of the course. Now, the first seminar, before I go into that, the handouts will be very detailed, available online, and have the same content as the PowerPoint presentation that you can see now. Now, the point of the handouts is that I would normally physically give them to you in lectures, so you don't need to have to write down lots and lots of notes. So what you can do is you can print them off from home if you can, or you can just save them on your computer and jot down notes electronically or physically, so you don't have to spend the whole lecture writing down lots and lots of notes. Now, the first tutorials will be online, and these will be merely introductory. They're not going to be held next week. They're going to be held the week after, so they will be held starting on the 12th, on the 12th of October, Thursday, 12th of October. These are going to be online because they're going to be mostly organisational, mostly me talking, and so it's worth saving the face-to-face tutorials for the more substantive content. Hopefully by then as well, things will have settled down a bit. A few more points. I'm going to plan on breaking down the lectures in various ways. So 2-hour lectures are obviously not ideal. You're not going to be getting 2-hour lectures. Lectures will often, like this one, be in 2 parts, potentially even more parts, depending on the topics. They're going to be pre-recorded, and there will be, as I've already said, handouts to accompany them. Now, I will aim to record all of the lectures and make them available before the official lecture slot. So what this means is that you'll be able to watch them in your own time. In the second half of the lecture slot, I want to hold live Q&A sessions. These will be 10 to 11 Mondays, in other words, starting from the 20th of October. That is, starting after the seminars have started. So the point of these sessions is going to be to try to replicate as far as is possible the lecture experience. So I think one of the key things in lectures is for you to be able to ask questions of me, things you don't understand, things you want me to elaborate in a lecture setting. The aim of these sessions will be able to ask any question you have about the course. Now, it's not required that you attend these, it's simply optional if you would like to. One final thing, probably quite obvious to you, but just to reiterate it, please keep abreast of Blackboard over the next few weeks, just for any announcements. Now more than ever, it's more important to keep on top of the potential communications that you might have from me and from the university. So what is the course about? The module is going to focus on the ethical questions about the alternatives to war. The content will lie between political philosophy and international relations. So what this means for you is that you're more confident doing political philosophy. You can focus on some of the philosophical issues. However, if you're less confident in political philosophy and more interested in some of the empirical questions, you can focus on these instead. The module is driven by the overarching question, what should be done instead of going to war? Now, why should we care about this question? Now, I've got a quote here. Who do you think said this? In dealing with those nations that break rules and laws, I believe that we must develop alternatives to violence that are tough enough to actually change behavior. For if we want lasting peace, then the words of the international community must mean something. Take a second, have a think. Barack Obama.
I've spoken at some length to the question that must weigh on our minds and our hearts as we choose to wage war. But let me now turn to our effort to avoid such tragic choices and speak of 3 ways that we can build a just and lasting peace. First, in dealing with those nations that break rules and laws, I believe that we must develop alternatives to violence that are tough enough to actually change behavior. For if we want a lasting peace, then the words of the international community must mean something. Those regimes that break the rules must be held accountable. Sanctions must exact a real price. Intransigence must be met with increased pressure, and such pressure exists only when the world stands together as one.
Now, more specifically, there are 2 reasons that I want to highlight why we should care about the alternatives to war. The first concerns the lack of understanding about the options in Syria. The conflict in Syria started in March 2011 in the context of the Arab Spring with a relatively peaceful uprising against the Assad government's authoritarian rule. In response to Assad's brutal crackdown on the protesters, the conflict quickly spiraled into a regional complex war involving various international actors, including Hezbollah, Russia, the UK, France, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. It was far from obvious what should be done in response to the conflict at the time. Much of the debate revolved around military intervention against the Assad regime. Despite the UK and US coming close to intervening in September 2013 against the Assad regime, against its use of chemical weapons, most commentators viewed that it would be too difficult to intervene successfully given Russia's military backing and given the military capacity of Syria. After 2014, the debate turned to whether military intervention should be launched against ISIS, the Islamic State group, which it was first by the US and then by France and later the UK, and in turn Russia. Again, the debate about military intervention largely dominated the discussion. There was little understanding of what, if anything, should be done in response to the conflict in Syria if military intervention was not to be pursued. There was often a general and patently forced sense in the public debate that the options were doing nothing or intervening militarily. Some options were tried, economic sanctions, arming rebels, but these measures, and which we'll explore in the case of economic sanctions, were problematic as well. In the meantime, it's estimated more than 500,000 people died in the conflict. Secondly, considering the alternatives to war is also important because it seems that major Western powers are less likely to go to war in the future. And this is for 4 reasons. The first reason concerns the decline of wars in general, the decline of major wars. It seems that the world is becoming a more peaceful place. This is at least the thesis of Steven Pinker, the Harvard scholar who argues as much in his book, Better Angels of Our Nature. And this short video illustrates the point that Pinker is trying to make.
Violence and war. The insane brutality of ISIS continues. The Russians are invading Ukraine, and the Palestinians and Israelis continue to slug it out. Does that make you feel gloomy? Well, don't, because if you look at the numbers, war actually seems to be going out of fashion, while the global population is at an all-time high. It seems that we live in the most peaceful period in human history. How is this possible? As of September 2014, there were 4 conflicts going on in the world that had caused at least 10,000 people to die since January 2013, 9 conflicts that killed more than 1,000 people, and 13 that killed more than 100 since January 2013. Not really peaceful, but consider this. Of all the conflicts going on, none is an active war between countries. They are either civil wars or local conflicts. Although civil wars are terrible and cause huge suffering, their impact is usually way smaller than a war between nations or empires. When 2 nations engage in war, they can mobilize much bigger forces, have access to all of the state's resources and logistics, and almost all of the population. So why have we transitioned from wars between nation-states to civil wars? A lot of it is to do with colonialism and the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, a major driver of armed conflict vanished too. But the breakup of the communist dictatorships revealed new or old tensions and brought new conflicts in the now freed states, which often resulted in civil war. Much more importantly, in 1945, nearly all of Africa, much of Asia, and parts of Latin America were under colonial rule. By 1990, all but a few islands were independent. But wait, couldn't you argue that what today's multinational corporations are doing in the Third World is just as bad as colonialism? Let's look at Congo. It was established as a colony in 1885 by the Belgian king, an area 80 times the size of Belgium. Violence committed against the indigenous Congolese and the ruthless system of economic exploitation had killed about half of the population by 1908. About 10 million Congolese were executed or starved to death. Millions were mutilated and traumatized. The economic exploitation of the Congo remained the top priority, and forced labor never really ceased completely until the end of Belgian rule in 1960, which is not really that long ago. So, no, colonialism was much worse than vulture capitalism is today, and it ended just 2 generations ago. Most of the conflicts that are going on right now are in areas that 60 years ago were under foreign control. But things are getting better. Until 1989, victory for one side in a civil war was common, while nowadays, victories are much rarer. At the same time, negotiated endings have jumped from 10% to almost 40%. What about the rest of the world? Why have nation-states stopped attacking each other? There are 4 major reasons. 1. Democratization. The steady development from autocracy to democracy. Democracies hardly ever fight each other. Of all the state-against-state wars fought since 1900, only a minority were fought between democracies. 2. Globalization. War is just not as effective at achieving economic goals as it used to be. Today, it's almost always cheaper to buy resources on the global market than to seize them by force. People from other nations are more valuable to us alive than dead, which overall is a pretty new concept. 3. War is so 20th century. Until World War I, warfare was seen as an inevitable part of the human experience and as a valuable tool which you could use to achieve goals when diplomacy hit a brick wall. Today we have rules that declare acts of aggression illegal and stipulate that armed force is only justified in self-defense or with the authority of the UN Security Council. These rules are still broken, but today it's harder to do so without sparking opposition and disapproval. Also, we have an international court for war crimes in The Hague, and that's a very recent innovation. 4. Borders are mostly fixed now. After World War II, territorial wars generally stopped when most countries pledged to accept international borders and respect other nations' autonomy. But is all of this just an anomaly, or are we on the road to lasting peace? Truth is, we don't know yet. We need a big enough sample to rule out the historical average, which is about 1 or 2 big wars per century. We just haven't had enough time since World War II to rule out the possibility that war is not going away. If we don't have one major war in the next 75 years, we can be really confident that humanity is changing. So, you see, war might be over. Yes, there are nasty conflicts going on in many places, but overall, things are getting better, and we can make them even better by speaking up for peace and democracy.
Now, I should note that this declinist thesis suggested in this video is controversial in international relations, and some don't agree with it. It's also focused on interstate war, so wars between states rather than civil wars or wars between international bodies and rebel groups. One final caveat is that this video is from 5 to 6 years ago. Since it was published, there has been an increase in conflict, it seems, particularly, but still not interstate conflict, intrastate conflict, and also something that we're going to look at more closely in the final weeks is an increase in incidents of mass atrocities. Okay, let's get back to the reasons why it seems likely that there's going to be less warfare in the future. At least warfare undertaken by the major Western powers. So the second reason why this seems likely is because of diminished public appetite for large-scale war or humanitarian intervention. There was significant public opposition in the aftermath of the failed interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan in the West. The significant public opposition to the potential intervention in Syria in 2013 indicates that any Western leader is likely to have to go against public opinion if they want to wage a major war in the future. What's more, the Trump administration, as far as it can be predictable, has made it clear that they doesn't want to engage in a large-scale military intervention abroad. Thirdly, there's been significant cuts to military expenditure. In the wake of financial crisis and neoliberal austerity measures, several states have cut the amount that they're spending on the militaries simply because they can't afford it, which makes it much more difficult for states to be able to wage wars, large-scale wars abroad. Fourthly, and perhaps most significantly, it seems likely that it's going to be more difficult to secure international support for major wars and intervention in the future, particularly in the UN Security Council, which is the main authorizing body necessary for humanitarian interventions abroad when they don't have the consent of the host state. What's particularly relevant here, and something we're going to look at in the module, is the rise of the non-Western powers, the rise of what are called the BRICS states: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, the BRICS are notoriously much more non-interventionist, at least in their rhetoric, and they often define their foreign policy agendas as opposed to Western interventionism. The BRICS states have opposed several actual and potential cases of humanitarian intervention, such as famously Russia vetoed the potential support in the UN Security Council for the intervention in Kosovo by NATO in 1999. There was Chinese support for the government of Sudan in the case of potential action in Darfur. And there's been, as you probably know, long-standing Russian support for Syria that has led to any opposition to robust action against the Assad regime. More generally, there's been long-standing opposition by Russia and China to democratic and human rights movements, and Brazil, India, South Africa have at times opposed humanitarian intervention and to strongly defended principles of non-intervention. So it seems likely then that major wars are not going to happen, at least led by the West, broad on the scales of Iraq and Afghanistan, and they will look to other means to try to fulfill their foreign policy goals. Indeed, you'll see that actually in the first few years of the Trump administration, some of the major issues have involved the alternatives to war that we're going to be looking at. And these include economic sanctions on Iran, how to deal with North Korea in terms of diplomacy, and potentially offering positive inducements, and cyber war. Now, what exactly is the course going to be focused on? Now, here is something I want you to try and bear in mind. There's an awful lot that can be done to try to prevent war, try to prevent mass atrocities, prevent conflict in the long run. For instance, education, lifting people out of poverty, generally seems likely to decrease the incidence of war, conflict, and mass atrocities. But education and poverty eradication are far too late for the case of Syria, far too late for the Rohingya, and other cases. So we're not going to focus on the prevention of conflicts and serious incidents. Instead, what we're going to focus on is what to do when there's already an ongoing serious crisis. So how to respond to Myanmar, Syria, Libya, so on, current crises that are ongoing. That's one way we're going to focus. The second way that we're going to focus on is the more serious cases. To explain this, think about the annual reports by Amnesty International. Every year they write detailed report listing human rights abuses worldwide. 2017, 2018, most recent report, they list 150 states affected by human rights abuses. However, not all of these abuses are extremely severe. Not severe enough, you might think, to justify going to war. So we're going to focus on the more serious cases. In particular, we're going to focus on the sorts of cases where there could potentially be a case for war. This is where these are mass atrocities or serious external aggression, where a state, for instance, threatens to invade another one. Considering the alternatives in these circumstances, in these more serious circumstances, is most interesting because it's when war would be a viable policy option. And so we'll really be considering the alternatives to war. Let's then consider in more detail what we're going to look at each week. Next week, we're going to look at actually what's a seemingly very straightforward question. Why is war wrong? And to do this, we're going to focus particularly on the critique of war provided by just war theory. Just war theory holds that war can sometimes be morally justified, but sometimes not, and in fact, often is morally unjustified. We're going to look at the critique of war provided by just war theorists through their very helpful criteria of jus ad bellum principles and jus in bello principles, focusing in particular on a last resort principle to see why we might think that war is problematic. These criteria, jus ad bellum, jus in bello, you might have encountered before, don't worry if you haven't, but they could be helpful for analysing the alternatives in later weeks as well. Then in the third week, we turn to economic sanctions and arms embargoes. So economic sanctions are probably the leading, most well-known alternative to going to war. Various forms of economic sanctions, smart sanctions, comprehensive sanctions. Smart sanctions can take several different forms themselves, including asset freezes, travel bans, so on and so forth. We'll be looking at those, looking at arms embargoes, which is one form of smart sanction as well. As you might be aware, economic sanctions are also very heavily criticised, particularly when they're comprehensive, but also sometimes smart sanctions. And they're criticised for two main reasons. One, for being ineffective, and one, for harming innocent population. We're going to look at these criticisms and see whether they're valid, as well as some of the other issues with economic sanctions. Then in week 4, we turn to diplomacy, diplomatic measures. So diplomacy is often viewed as doing nothing, just talking. But we're going to see that there's actually quite a lot that can be done by states diplomatically. For instance, they can criticize other states, sometimes called naming and shaming. They can try to persuade other states, they can mediate in conflicts, they can engage in negotiation. Or they can cut ties with states, they can expel ambassadors. All of these issues, all of these measures raise some interesting issues. For instance, is it acceptable for the UK to criticize other states' human rights records when it doesn't have a particularly strong human rights record of its own, such as on questions about asylum. In week 5, we turn to perhaps a measure you were going to be skeptical about initially. And this is non-violence in the face of a serious external aggression and mass atrocities. So after all, if you're walking down the street and get attacked, you might think that non-violence won't work. You should fight back, run off, but non-violent measures won't work. Similarly, you might think that there's not going to be much going for with states or other actors using non-violent measures in response to mass atrocities, serious external aggression. But interestingly, we're going to look at the potential that there's actually a lot more that can be said for non-violent measures than at first seems. For instance, recent findings suggest that non-violent revolutions are 6 times more likely to succeed than violent ones. And apparently non-violence even worked in Nazi Germany. There are also interesting measures such as civilian peacekeeping, which involves unarmed civilian bodyguards to protect human rights bodies. In week 5, we'll also consider pacifism and the relationship between non-violent resistance and pacifism. Then in week 6, we turn to positive inducements. This again is a little understood alternative. Most of the various things that states can do are often coercive and involve negative sanctions. So involve criticizing, involve economic sanctions, imposing costs on the state that you've got issue with. In week 6, we're going to look at whether states and other actors should be offering positive inducements, rewards, to try to encourage aggressors to change their behavior. So, for instance, would it be acceptable to offer Assad $500 million to step down? Suppose he would have accepted this. Should this have been done? Now, on the one hand, you might think, it's great if it worked, we should do it. On the other hand, you might think it's very problematic to give a brutal dictator such a large reward. It encourages such sorts of behavior in the future and gives them a reward that they don't deserve. So in week 6 then, we consider various forms of incentive, positive incentives, and the ethical issues that arise from this. Then on to week 7. Week 7 is going to focus on the international criminal system. We focus particularly on the ICC, the International Criminal Court. This was established in 2002 and sits in The Hague. The ICC has engaged in several high-profile prosecutions, but has also been subject to some notable criticisms. For instance, it's been accused of bias against Africa, since many of the prosecutions have been of African figures. Then in week 8, we turn to a very recent measure, cyber war. And we look at whether cyber measures should actually be seen as war, subject to the same sorts of problems as war, some of the potential benefits and drawbacks of cyber measures as an alternative to war. For instance, we'll look at whether cyber war would harm fewer people. In the final week, we step back. We consider the ethics of the alternatives war in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the various challenges that this brings to the forefront. For instance, some think that it will lead to more conflict in the future, but also financial implications might make it too costly for certain states to go to war. We'll also look more closely at the potential move towards a post-liberal order and the rise of the BRICS and what this means for the alternatives that we've been looking at. Finally, in week 10, we'll conclude and we'll focus on the assignments that will be due shortly afterwards. 2 more quick points. Firstly, there's no recommended purchase for this module. 2 books are most relevant. My book, probably obviously, you can download this online. You can buy it if you want, you can download it online. Also, a book by Cecile Fabre on the economic statecraft that's particularly useful for looking at economic sanctions. Some other generally useful texts if you want to read more around the subject. So Alex Bellamy's got a very nice report, the web link there. an excellent edited collection by Michael Gross and Tammy Meisels on what they call soft war, the ethics of unarmed conflict. Looks at many of the measures that we're going to be looking at in the course. And also there's a roundtable that I organised for ethics and international affairs that focuses on the alternatives to war, and particularly some measures that aren't normally considered in thinking about the ethics of alternatives to war. One final point before the end of this first part of the lecture, just to flag this up, there are going to be seminar tasks for every week. The details of what's going to be required in these tasks I'll explain in the seminars themselves, starting on October the 12th. You won't need to do a seminar task for the first week. Okay, see you in a minute for part 2.